My comments for today are largely a product of study sessions that Grilla Toronto held to think through these issues as a collective, but I will also incorporate some of my own thoughts. So I want to begin today on the question of cooperation and development, given that this phrase is in the title of the event. The central hinge in this conversation, in my view, is should we celebrate the contemporary relationship between African states and China as in the genre of South-South development that the Global South dreamed of in the mid-20th century, or are contemporary Africa-China relations a new imperialist dynamic emerging through the crisis of US hegemony as China assumes the role of an emerging world power? As Vijay Prashad elucidates in The Darker Nations, the Third World is not a place, but a political project. In the mid-20th century, at the height of US hegemony, the Global South imagined political, economic, and social emancipation. One important incarnation of this, as was mentioned by Amit in the introductions to this event today, was the Bandung Conference in 1955, where representatives of 29 newly independent Asian and African states met to promote what's now termed South-South Cooperation. In other words, the idea that African and Asian states could come together for economic and cultural cooperation and together oppose colonialism and imperialism. Bandung, as we mentioned earlier, was institutionalized in the non-aligned movement, but the non-aligned movement was not without its critics. So Muammar Gaddafi famously said of the non-aligned movement that the world is made up of two camps, the liberation camp and the imperialist one. There's no place for those who are non-aligned, we're not neutral and totally aligned against the aggressor. And as Gaddafi saw it, the Global South was not comprised of states who were beholden to US imperialism on the one hand, states beholden to Soviet imperialism on another, and then the states that opposed either influence. In Gaddafi's assessment, there were only two states, those who were against imperialism and for liberation, and others that were imperialist or dominated by imperialism. So our understandings of contemporary imperialism, however, are shaped by the lived experience of the 20th century of US hegemony and the particular way in which it supplanted European colonial rule with new dependent relationships of exploitation of the same character, but through new forms of politico-economic relationships between the United States and the Global South. But with the crisis of US hegemony starting in the 1970s, and now with a more pronounced global crisis since 2008 of perhaps the capitalist world system itself, imperialism as we know it will also necessarily change. Forms of power and hierarchy need to be remade so that they can continue on as they lose moral authority. The United States has lost its moral authority for global rule, providing openings for a new hegemonic power to emerge and to lead the world economy in overcoming the current crisis. For example, the transition from British hegemony in the 19th century to US hegemony in the 20th, we see imperialism persist, but the form it took changed. Formal colonialism lost its moral authority, which led to the important development of flag independence across much of the Global South. But in this absence of formal political rule through colonialism, the United States innovated new articulations of imperialism during the Cold War and beyond. Any new hegemon, as part of its rule, must convince the rest of the world that it is acting in the best interests of the interstate system. Part of the establishment of that consent to rule entails forming dependent relationships with the Global South that appear to be in the best interests of the Global South. With the rise of a new world hegemon, imperialism must necessarily be remade to look like aid, cooperation, and solidarity. This helps the rising hegemon establish a global moral authority as it appears to be acting in the moral interests of the entire world economy. In these phases of world history where a new hegemon is on the rise, it's critically important that we can distinguish between true South-South cooperation that has the potential for national liberation from a new incarnation of imperialism in its guise. When we examine this distinction between South-South cooperation on the one hand and contemporary imperialism from the perspective on the ground, it's critically important to understand local political conditions that can create an imbalance of power. Therefore, we must better understand the contemporary dynamics of African sovereignty. While the 21st century began with revolutions to oust decades of post-colonial authoritarian rule in places like Egypt, Tunisia, Sudan, and elsewhere, these efforts were short-lived. Counter-revolutionary forces, particularly those led by right-wing nationalists and conservative religious leaders, too often became the eventual beneficiaries of movements that toppled authoritarian regimes. And in recent years, we've witnessed more counter-revolutions and coups across the African continent. In Chad, for example, states succumbing to authoritarianism has become more prevalent, and we seldom observe revolutions that have been successful at installing long-lasting democratic states committed to promoting the interests of African people. In this fraught context of authoritarian rule across the continent, it's been easier for imperialists to usurp African sovereignty. Just as European and North American states have found authoritarian rule in Africa more amenable to their political economic interests, so too has China. In Zambia, for example, copper mining accounts for 65% of the country's export earnings. Most of the mines are owned by the Chinese state, though few are mining companies with headquarters in Canada. Foreign mining companies have been able to create pockets of Chinese state sovereignty within Zambia, where labor laws are notoriously lax, wages low, accidents and deaths of workers prevalent. When workers have protested these conditions, they've been met with violence, not from the Zambian state, but from Chinese management, who's met workers' demands by deploying violence without consequence. Another example would be the Lamu project to build a deep water port connecting East Africa to Asian export markets, which was initially funded by the Kenyan, Ethiopian, and South Sudanese states. But because of funding issues and occasional attacks on port construction by al-Shabaab, Kenyan Defense Forces sought loans from China, which were supported through the Maritime Silk Road program, which is a policy not only to aid China in gaining further access to African resources and markets, but also to enable the People's Liberation Army Navy to establish a counterterrorism base in northern Kenya. Ports are crucial to African development, as 90% of East African exporters depend on seaports to remain viable. But if Kenya defaults on the debt they've incurred, which seems likely, the Lamu port will soon become yet another space of Chinese state sovereignty in sub-Saharan Africa. Land grabbing through creating pockets of Chinese state sovereignty and through control of strategic assets has helped China obtain cheap natural resources needed for industrial production, while railroads, other infrastructure, along with access to seaports, allows for the extraction of these resources from sub-Saharan Africa. Regime change has not been successful in disrupting this dynamic because the movements for regime change have mostly focused on ousting political leaders. But as a result of European and North American imperialism, and also through the support of the domestic bourgeoisie, sovereignty in most African states rests with the military. Recent revolutions have done little to disrupt this or to create states that will serve the interests of the people. Since the mid-20th century, the most commonly proposed left solution to neocolonialism and imperialism has been delinking. In this era of globalization, however, we've seen, especially during the pandemic, that cutting off Africa's ties to the global economy can hurt the very people delinking tends to liberate. Yet there's a difference between globalization done on the terms of more powerful states and a horizontal internationalism based on solidarity. Africa-China relations in and of themselves could bring great benefit to both regions, but as long as there remains a power differential in African states' individual dealings with China, it will remain a tie that will ultimately result in economic benefit for China and the exploitation of Africa. One possible solution could be to have negotiations around Chinese development projects in African states done as a regional bloc through a Pan-African Union rather than country by country. But beyond this, what we as an internationalist left can do is decenter the role of the state in Africa-China relations. If civil society and leftist groups in both China and across the African continent could work together across borders, it could put pressure on states to realize common social injustices in both China and in various African contexts, such as the importance of opposing authoritarian regimes that fail to serve the best interests of the people and promoting workers' rights through a labor internationalism. We can also envision linkages between other Chinese and Pan-African civil society organizations around common issues that are relevant to both the African and Chinese contexts. Frantz Fanon famously described the Third World Project, as he called it, as a rejection of the goal of catching up to Europe and North America, and instead saw its primary goal to innovate a new way of thinking. Fanon believed in the creativity of the revolutionary leftist Global South, that new forms of politics could be envisioned and enacted that would provide solutions to longstanding social problems. There's a tendency within the global North left to see any political development that opposes Western dominance as something to celebrate. But in thinking through the complexity of contemporary Africa-China relations, it's evident that we need to be more discerning about the dynamics of power involved in the movements that may claim to be South-South cooperation and/or anti-Western. They may yet be an embodiment of the unequal power dynamics and politico-economic exploitation we stand firmly against. Propaganda, as many of esteemed colleagues have mentioned, coming from the West, but also from China, obscures the power dynamics at play on the ground in Sino-African relations. The ability of propaganda to muddy our understanding of the dynamics at play makes organizing around these issues particularly difficult and controversial. But we need to remember, as leftists based in Canada or anywhere else for that matter, that just because something is anti-West doesn't make it automatically liberatory. So we need to be thoughtful and discerning about how we think about power and history in our contemporary context. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the conversation and questions.